The 6th of January, 1944. At the 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England, Major General Jimmy Doolittle observed a sign in the office of Major General William Kepner, the esteemed commander of the 8th Fighter Command. The prominent display above Kepner's desk bore a clear and simple declaration. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle reread the words, then turned to Kepner with a quiet but firm statement. That sign needs to come down. It is wrong. Within hours, a replacement sign graced the wall, its message radically altered. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This pivotal moment marked one of the most significant tactical shifts of the Second World War, a complete reformation of fighter doctrine that would dismantle the Luftwaffe within mere weeks. What bomber crews had initially decried as suicidal, and some commanders had deemed reckless, would ultimately prove to be the strategic masterstroke that secured air supremacy over Europe. The very mathematics of aerial combat were on the verge of being redefined, not solely through advancements in technology, but through a single general's resolve to prioritize outcomes over entrenched dogma. The mounting crisis had been building for months. On the 14th of October, 1943, 291 American B-17 bombers embarked on their second assault against Schweinfurt, a critical industrial hub deep within Germany. The objective was paramount: ball-bearing plants, the very linchpins of German war production. The Americans successfully reached their target, unleashing their ordnance with devastating precision. However, the cost was nothing short of catastrophic. 60 bombers failed to return, and an additional 17 were damaged beyond repair, resulting in the loss of 600 men, either dead or missing, in a single afternoon.
American bomber crews faced odds so daunting that completing the mandatory 25-mission tour became statistically improbable. During the bleakest periods of 1942 and 1943, survival rates plummeted to between 25 and 35%. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the renowned Memphis Belle and one of the few crews to successfully complete their tour, confided in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The fortresses protect themselves well, but it is not enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." The German fighters had perfected devastatingly effective tactics. They would mass beyond the operational range of Allied escort fighters, then launch mass assaults. Their head-on passes through bomber formations, where closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour, afforded American gunners mere seconds to react. Fighters armed with 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets possessed the capability to obliterate a B-17 with a single, well-aimed strike. The core issue was straightforward. American escort fighters, specifically the P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, lacked the necessary range to accompany bombers on missions to distant targets. During the Schweinfurt raid, the escorts had been forced to disengage 300 miles from the objective, leaving the bombers to press on alone, fighting for survival against German fighters that attacked with virtual impunity. General Henry Arnold, the commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, issued a stark ultimatum in December 1943. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, cannot proceed. American bombers cannot continue to sustain such losses.
Find a solution, or the strategic bombing campaign ends. The solution arrived in November 1943, embodied in a sleek silver fighter that would fundamentally alter the course of the war, the North American P-51 Mustang. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, capable of delivering 1,695 horsepower under war emergency power, the Mustang possessed capabilities that seemed almost beyond belief. With the addition of drop tanks,
The Mustang could escort bombers for 1,600 miles, reaching any target in Germany and returning safely. Its cruising speed of 437 miles per hour surpassed that of any German fighter. At high altitudes, where the rarefied air tested the limits of most engines, the Mustang's two-stage supercharged Merlin engine excelled. This formidable fighter could ascend to 41,000 feet and engage effectively at heights where German Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf aircraft struggled. Captain Chuck Yeager, flying P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group, articulated the aircraft's profound impact in his combat report. The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go anywhere the bombers go and fight when we get there. This changes everything. However, possessing the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets was only half the equation. The tactical deployment of these escorts would ultimately determine the victor. Under the prevailing doctrine, fighters flew in tight formations encircling the bomber streams, maintaining visual contact with their charges at all times. Should German fighters attack, American escorts would engage them, but only briefly, sufficient to drive them off before resuming their defensive positioning. The overriding priority remained the protection of the bombers. This defensive posture fostered a fatal dynamic. German pilots could dictate the timing and location of their attacks. They would mass beyond visual range, dive through bomber formations at maximum speed, inflict casualties, and then escape before American fighters could mount an effective counter-assault. The escorts consistently reacted to German initiatives rather than seizing the offensive. Major General Ira Eaker, the outgoing commander of the 8th Air Force, had deeply entrenched this defensive doctrine. Eaker, a bomber pilot himself, held a steadfast conviction that bombers could adequately defend themselves through the interlocking fields of fire from their machine guns. Fighters, in his view, were intended to supplement this defense, not supplant it. Jimmy Doolittle perceived the situation with a starkly different perspective. Doolittle was not a bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and a renowned racing champion who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He possessed an intimate understanding of aircraft performance that few others could match. More importantly, he grasped the intricacies of tactical dynamics. The daring April 18, 1942 raid on Tokyo, executed by 16 B-25 bombers launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet, had been audacious, technically challenging, and strategically brilliant. Doolittle himself had been awarded the Medal of Honor for personally leading that groundbreaking mission. Now, commanding the 8th Air Force with a mandate from General Arnold to resolve the fighter problem, he was poised to enact radical change. On his first full day in command, January 6, 1944, Doolittle met with General Kepner and issued his revolutionary directive. Fighters were no longer to remain in close defensive proximity to bombers. Instead, they were to operate ahead of the bomber stream, extending up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to either flank, actively hunting German fighters. Following the bombers' attacks and their subsequent turn for home, American fighters were not to accompany them back. Rather, they were to sweep across Germany at low altitudes, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and targeting trains and fuel depots. The objective transcended mere bomber protection. It was the complete annihilation of the Luftwaffe. This order sent shockwaves through American fighter pilots and instilled terror in bomber crews. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the celebrated 4th Fighter Group, immediately grasped the significance. "This is what we have been asking for," he declared to his pilots. "Freedom to hunt. We are no longer shepherds guarding sheep. We are wolves." Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, operations officer for the 354th Fighter Group, captured the bomber crew's apprehension. "The men flying the fortresses and liberators think we are abandoning them. They believe fighters leaving them alone to hunt Germans elsewhere is insanity. They do not understand that killing German fighters before they reach the bombers is better protection than shooting them down after they attack. The bomber crew's fears were not unfounded. They had survived missions solely because fighters remained close, repelling attackers. Now, those fighters would vanish over the horizon, leaving the bombers seemingly defenseless. Many crews interpreted Doolittle's order as a death sentence, authored by a general who, in their view, failed to comprehend their perilous war. The German response to these new American tactics would either validate or condemn Doolittle's audacious gamble. For the Luftwaffe, the winter of 1943 to 1944 had appeared to herald an impending victory in the air war. Despite 3 years of Allied bombing, German fighter production had actually surged. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories were delivering over 1,000 fighters monthly. German pilots had devised effective tactics against American formations. The heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, equipped with substantial cannons and underwing pods, could decimate bombers in a single attack run. These were supported by faster Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, tasked with engaging American escorts, while the FW-190s wreaked havoc on the bombers. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, believed the Luftwaffe was winning the war of attrition. In November 1943, he reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that American bomber losses were unsustainable. "If we maintain this pressure," he wrote, "the Americans will be forced to abandon daylight bombing by spring." However, Galland's analysis contained a critical blind spot. He concentrated on aircraft production figures while neglecting pilot attrition. Germany was manufacturing fighters at a rate exceeding the Allies' ability to destroy them on the ground or in factories. Yet, Germany could not replace experienced pilots at a rate even remotely comparable to their losses in combat. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe suffered nearly 3,000 fighter pilot casualties, including killed, wounded, or missing. Training time for new pilots had been drastically reduced from 250 hours to 150 hours to meet the overwhelming demand. Consequently, new German pilots entered combat with barely sufficient skill to operate their aircraft, let alone engage seasoned American aviators effectively. Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilot with 8 confirmed victories, described the escalating problem in a letter to his brother in January 1944. "The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they are killed. They do not know how to dogfight. They cannot work with their wingmen. They freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while also fighting the Americans. It is becoming impossible." The prevailing weather conditions in early 1944 delayed the crucial test of Doolittle's innovative tactics. Winter storms grounded bombers for extended periods. However, on January 29th, when over 800 bombers launched an offensive against Frankfurt, the new American fighter tactics were unleashed. P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group surged ahead of the bomber stream at 28,000 feet, flying in dispersed formations that maximized both visibility and reaction time. They were not tethered to specific bomber formations. Instead, they actively hunted for German fighters wherever they might appear. Near Bonn, American fighters detected a formation of 50 Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbing to intercept the bombers. Rather than awaiting the German attack, the Mustangs plunged upon them. The Germans, anticipating an attack on bombers at their own pace, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against fighters possessing superior speed and altitude. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. 13 German fighters were shot down. 2 Mustangs sustained damage but successfully returned to base. The remaining German formation scattered, never reaching the bombers. Captain Don Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group on a parallel mission that same day, recounted the impact of the new tactics. "We caught 20 Focke-Wulf FW-190s forming up over Cologne. They were slow, heavy with ammunition and fuel, climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before the rest could escape. This is how you win a war. The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day observed a remarkable phenomenon. German fighter attacks, which typically commenced far from the target and persisted throughout the bomb run, had largely failed to materialize. A few isolated engagements occurred, but the mass formations that had devastated previous raids never materialized. The new fighter tactics had effectively intercepted them. The ultimate test, however, arrived in February 1944 with Operation Argument, soon to be widely known as Big Week. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, conceived this operation as a deliberate trap. American bombers would target German aircraft factories and other facilities so vital that the Luftwaffe would be compelled to defend them with every available asset. The primary objective was not merely the destruction of the factories, although that would be a welcome consequence. The true aim was to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition against American fighters, who now possessed numerical superiority, superior performance, and superior combat skills. The 20th of February, 1944. Clear skies graced Germany for the first time in weeks. Over 1,000 American bombers, operating from England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters, launched an assault against 12 distinct aircraft production facilities, the largest single-day aerial armada in history. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's leading ace with 352 victories, observed the American formation passing overhead and immediately understood the strategic implication. "This is not a bombing raid," he informed his squadron. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse. They want us to come up and fight, and we have no choice." The Luftwaffe responded with overwhelming force. Over 900 German fighters scrambled to intercept the American formations. The skies over central Germany erupted into the largest aerial engagement in history. Contrails from thousands of aircraft crisscrossed at altitudes ranging from sea level to 40,000 feet. Crucially, American fighters were no longer bound defensively to bomber formations. They operated across hundreds of miles of German airspace, engaging German fighters wherever they were encountered, on the ground, in the process of taking off, forming up, or en route to the bombers. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted relentlessly. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me 262 jets, Germany's revolutionary new fighter, taking off from an airfield near Leipzig. The jets, though fast and deadly once airborne, were vulnerable during their takeoff phase. Drew dove from 30,000 feet, screaming through anti-aircraft fire, and opened up on the lead jet as it lifted off the runway. The jet exploded. He destroyed a second jet before it could gain speed. The remaining jets scattered. Drew's combat report became legendary. "The jets are dangerous in the air, but they must take off and land like any aircraft. Catch them there, and they burn like any other." The first day of Big Week resulted in the loss of 21 American bombers and 4 fighters. By the grim standards of Schweinfurt, just 3 months prior, this outcome was nothing short of miraculous. German losses, however, were catastrophic. Over 50 fighters destroyed. More critically, 38 pilots were killed or seriously wounded. For the subsequent 5 days, whenever weather permitted, the offensive continued. American bombers struck Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt, once more, Gotha, and Augsburg. Each raid involved hundreds of bombers and fighters, each forcing the Luftwaffe to respond. Each raid exacted a toll of fighters and pilots that Germany could not replenish. Major Heinz Baer, a German ace with over 220 victories, chronicled the impossible situation in his diary. "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up, and they attack us before we can attack. We land to refuel and they strafe the airfield. We take off and they are waiting. There is no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and pilots. By February 25th, when Big Week concluded, the statistics spoke a stark truth. American losses amounted to 226 heavy bombers and 28 escort fighters, with approximately 2,600 casualties. While these were significant losses, American production and training capabilities could replace them within a month. German losses were staggering: over 350 fighters destroyed, and an additional 90 damaged beyond repair. More devastatingly, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 pilots killed and over 50 seriously wounded. These pilots, on average, possessed over 3 years of combat experience. They were irreplaceable. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ehlert, commander of a Jagdgeschwader 77 fighter wing, wrote in his report to Galland, "We are losing our most experienced men. The new pilots cannot survive against the American fighters. Within 3 months, we will have aircraft, but no one capable of flying them in combat." Doolittle's strategy extended beyond aerial combat. The second phase of his directive, the strafing attacks on German airfields and infrastructure, proved equally devastating. Daily, as American fighters returned from escort missions, they would descend to low altitudes and target opportunities across Germany. Airfields bore the brunt of these assaults. Fighters parked in the open, aircraft undergoing maintenance, fuel trucks, and hangars all became prime targets. German pilots described returning from combat missions only to find their home airfields under attack, forcing them to divert to alternate bases or land amidst incoming strafing runs. Major Günther Röhl, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, articulated the psychological impact. "We used to feel safe on our own airfields. Nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and evening. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics are killed servicing aircraft. Fuel trucks explode. We cannot maintain operations under constant attack." The cumulative effect became undeniably apparent in March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin itself. On March 6th, 730 bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, struck the German capital. The symbolic and strategic significance of Berlin mandated that the Luftwaffe commit its maximum effort to defense. They did. Over 150 German fighters engaged the American formations. The ensuing battle raged across hundreds of miles as fighters clashed while bombers pressed toward their objectives. When the final tally was complete, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans, however, lost 160 aircraft destroyed and an additional 50 damaged. The pilot casualties were staggering. Nearly 70 experienced fighter pilots killed or wounded in a single day. For the Luftwaffe, it was a disaster from which recovery was impossible. Captain Johannes Trautloft, a Gruppenkommandeur of Jagdgeschwader 52, survived the March 6th battle and wrote that evening, "Today, I watched the German fighter arm die. We threw everything against them and it was not enough. They shot us down faster than we could shoot them down. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent. The war is lost." Between January and May 1944, the cumulative attrition became unsustainable for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, representing nearly a quarter of all available fighter pilots at the start of the period. More critically, these losses fell heaviest upon the most experienced pilots. The veterans, the men with dozens or hundreds of victories, the squadron and group commanders, the instructors, these individuals were systematically eliminated. They perished because they were the most aggressive, because they led from the front, because they attempted to protect the inexperienced newcomers. 28 German aces with over 30 kills died between January and May. 8 aces with over 100 kills were killed or captured. Each of these men represented years of training and combat experience. Each was literally irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not keep pace. In 1944, Germany graduated 29,000 new fighter pilots, but training time had plummeted to just 110 hours of total flight time by mid-year, with some late-war pilots receiving as little as 50 hours. American pilots, during the same period, received over 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in their combat aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, described the dire situation regarding new pilots in his final letter home before being killed in action in October 1943. The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly formation properly. They do not understand tactical principles. They panic under fire. In combat with experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, they survive 1, maybe 2 missions. Then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time. The disparity in aircraft production told another part of the story. In the first 6 months of 1944, American factories produced over 22,000 fighter aircraft. German factories, despite dispersal efforts to evade bombing, manufactured 9,000 fighters. The sheer volume of aircraft was daunting, but the qualitative superiority sealed the outcome. The P-51 Mustang outclassed the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 in nearly every engagement scenario. It boasted greater speed, extended range, exceptional high-altitude performance, and at least equal, if not superior, agility. Colonel Hubert Ska, leading the 56th Fighter Group in their P-47 Thunderbolts, remarked on the compounded effect. "We possess more aircraft, superior aircraft, pilots with better training, more effective strategies, and an endless supply of fuel and munitions. Our adversaries, though valiant and flying-capable planes, are unable to sustain them or provide adequate resources. Their bravery cannot indefinitely overcome such profound disadvantages." By April of 1944, this shift was undeniable. The operational strength of German fighters, in terms of available aircraft and pilots, had diminished to less than 60% of its January figures. More critically, the combat effectiveness of their remaining forces had plummeted disastrously. The seasoned units that had once decimated bomber formations in October of 1943 were no more. The revamped Luftwaffe comprised predominantly novice pilots flying aircraft with insufficient fuel, meager ammunition, and minimal upkeep. They were confronting American formations that grew in size and confidence with each sortie. On the 8th of May, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched nearly 900 bombers against oil production facilities and railway junctions across Germany, supported by over 750 escort fighters. Not a single German fighter was dispatched to intercept them. For the first time, the Luftwaffe yielded control of the skies without a struggle. General Galland conveyed the grim reality to Göring that day. "Our fighter force is annihilated. We have aircraft, but cannot fly them due to a lack of fuel. We have pilots, but most lack the proficiency to engage effectively. The Americans strike at their leisure. We can no longer challenge their aerial dominance." The strategic ramifications became starkly evident on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied air forces executed over 14,000 sorties on the inaugural day of the invasion, while Luftwaffe fighters flew fewer than 300. This overwhelming air advantage permitted Allied ground attack aircraft to obliterate German positions, while bombers relentlessly isolated the battlefield. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, sent a desperate message to his wife on June 10th. "The enemy holds complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move during daylight without being subjected to attack. Our supply lines are severed. Without air cover, we cannot hold these invasion beaches." The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 was astonishing. Just 6 months prior, the Luftwaffe had appeared capable of bleeding the American bomber offensive to death. Now, they had effectively vanished as a cohesive fighting force over Western Europe. The statistics from those pivotal 6 months paint a picture of systematic annihilation. Between January and June of 1944, the Luftwaffe suffered the loss of over 2,500 fighter pilots, killed or severely wounded in combat over the Reich. This represented roughly 75% of their fighter pilot strength at the beginning of that period. American losses during the same time frame amounted to approximately 420 fighter pilots killed or missing, and 7,000 bomber crew casualties who were killed, wounded, or captured. While these losses were considerable, they were sustainable given America's robust training infrastructure and prodigious aircraft production capabilities. The aerial kill ratios had completely inverted. In October 1943, German fighters were destroying American bombers at an astonishing rate of 20 for every German fighter lost. By May 1944, American fighters were eliminating German fighters at a 4-to-1 ratio. Beyond mere numbers, the psychological shift was equally profound. German pilots who had entered 1944 brimming with confidence now flew missions bracing for death. American pilots, once apprehensive of German fighters, now pursued them with relentless aggression. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who concluded the war with approximately 20 aerial victories, described the metamorphosis. In January, we were relieved if the Germans didn't attack. By March, we were disappointed when they retreated. By May, we were frustrated by the scarcity of opponents. The transformation was absolute. The triumph of Doolittle's strategy vindicated his audacious gamble, though it introduced an intriguing historical irony. His approach, initially decried by many bomber commanders as a reckless abandonment, had in fact preserved the bombing campaign. By neutralizing German fighters before they could threaten the bombers, aggressive fighter tactics proved far more protective than defensive escort missions ever could have been. General Spaatz acknowledged this in his June 1944 assessment. General Doolittle's decision to unleash the fighters was the critical factor in securing air superiority. We destroyed more German fighters in 4 months than in the preceding 2 years. The key lay in allowing fighters to hunt rather than compelling them to defend. Major General Frederick Anderson, who succeeded Eaker as commander of bomber operations, confessed his initial reservations had been misguided. I believed keeping fighters in close proximity to bombers was the sole means of protection. I was wrong. Eliminating enemy fighters before they engage is far more effective than engaging them during their attacks. General Doolittle grasped this. I did not. This tactical revolution extended beyond mere doctrine, fundamentally altering the conception of aerial warfare. Prior to Doolittle's January directive, escort fighters were viewed as supplementary defensive assets for bombers. Post-Big Week, fighters were recognized as the primary instrument for achieving air superiority, with bombers occasionally serving as decoys to draw enemy fighters into engagement. This paradigm shift would profoundly influence Air Force doctrine for decades to come. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all subsequent conflicts would draw upon the lessons learned in early 1944. Air supremacy is achieved through the proactive elimination of enemy aircraft, not through the reactive defense of friendly assets. However, the human toll of this strategy remained significant. Over 10,000 American airmen perished in the skies over Europe during the first half of 1944. The bomber crews who undertook missions day after day, aware that each sortie could be their last, displayed extraordinary bravery. The fighter pilots who accepted the perilous task of hunting German fighters deep within enemy territory demonstrated remarkable skill and audacious aggression. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who survived to become the second highest scoring American ace in Europe with 27 victories, reflected on the cost years later. We discussed tactics, strategy, and numbers, But what truly transpired was thousands of young men climbing into aircraft daily, flying into combat with the knowledge that many would not return. We prevailed because we possessed greater courage, superior skill, better aircraft, more effective tactics, and superior leadership. We won because Jimmy Doolittle understood that protecting bombers necessitated eliminating fighters, not remaining in their vicinity. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive defensive organization. Individual units continued to fight with great valor and occasional successes. New jet aircraft, like the Messerschmitt 262, demonstrated revolutionary potential. However, the systematic decimation of the pilot corps during the first half of the year proved irreversible. Germany manufactured over 36,000 fighters in 1944, its highest annual total of the war. Yet, there were insufficient trained pilots to fly them, inadequate fuel to train existing pilots, a lack of experienced leadership to develop effective strategies, and insufficient time to reconstruct what had been lost. Captain Erich Rudorfer, one of the few German aces to survive the war with over 220 victories, summarized the predicament. We had aircraft in abundance by late 1944, modern fighters, even jets, but we lacked experienced pilots to fly them. The Americans had eliminated all the proficient pilots in the spring. The war was already lost by the time our production reached its peak. Doolittle's successful strategy established a blueprint for modern aerial warfare that remains relevant today. Air superiority is not achieved defensively. It demands aggressive offensive action against enemy aircraft and infrastructure. Technological advantage is important, but training quality is paramount. Numerical superiority is decisive only when coupled with qualitative superiority. Perhaps most crucially, leadership willing to challenge established doctrine and embrace calculated risks can yield strategic outcomes far exceeding incremental improvements to existing methods. Doolittle's decision to alter the sign in Kapitän's office was more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental reimagining of fighter deployment. The bomber crews, initially apprehensive of Doolittle's tactics as an abandonment, came to understand and value the strategy. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a Stars and Stripes reporter who flew bombing missions to cover the air war, wrote in June 1944, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us. It sounds paradoxical, but it is true. When they stayed close, the Germans attacked anyway. When they flew ahead and hunted, the Germans could not reach us. The best defense was a good offense. General Doolittle understood this. We did not. He was correct." By the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied air forces had attained complete air supremacy over Western Europe. German aircraft still operated, but in such limited numbers and with such restricted effectiveness that they could not meaningfully challenge Allied aerial operations. The invasion's success was largely attributable to soldiers fighting without the constant threat of enemy air attack. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, acknowledged this in his post-invasion assessment. The air forces provided us with the single most essential element for success. They granted us the freedom to operate without interference from enemy aircraft. General Doolittle's fighter tactics effectively dismantled the Luftwaffe at a critical juncture. History will undoubtedly regard this as one of the war's decisive campaigns. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 stands as one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In October, the Luftwaffe was winning the attritional battle over Germany, making the strategic bombing campaign appear unsustainable and doomed. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was shattered. American bombers returned with minimal losses, and Allied ground forces prepared to invade France under complete air cover. The change was so profound and so rapid that German commanders struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. General Galland, in his post-war memoirs, pinpointed the turning point with precision. When the Americans altered their fighter tactics in January 1944, they secured the air war. We could contend with American bombers. We could not simultaneously engage their fighters and their bombers. Once they liberated their fighters to hunt us, we were doomed. The end was simply a matter of time. The final statistics of the campaign underscore its overwhelming success. Between January and December of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action over the Reich. American and British fighters destroyed over 11,000 German fighters, both in aerial combat and on the ground. German fighter pilot training time decreased from 200 hours in 1943 to less than 100 hours by late 1944. American losses during the same period totaled approximately 750 fighter pilots and 16,000 bomber crew casualties. These were significant losses, yet American training schools graduated over 35,000 new pilots in 1944, and American factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratio in aerial combat shifted decisively. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters achieved approximately 1.2 kills for every loss. In 1944, this ratio inverted, with American fighters achieving 3.7 kills for every loss. By 1945, the ratio surpassed 7-to-1. Perhaps the most telling statistic, however, was pilot experience levels. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot possessed over 200 hours of combat experience. By January 1945, the average had fallen to under 50 hours. The Luftwaffe had not run out of aircraft or fuel, though both were scarce. It had exhausted its supply of trained pilots capable of effective combat. Doolittle's controversial decision achieved precisely what General Arnold had demanded. It annihilated the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force prior to the Normandy invasion. It demonstrated that aggressive offensive fighter tactics were more effective than defensive escort tactics. It proved that winning air superiority required the destruction of enemy fighters, not merely the protection of friendly bombers. The human cost was immense. Over 26,000 American airmen perished in the skies over Europe during World War II, a greater number of fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force alone sustained over 47,000 casualties. These men achieved air superiority through courage, skill, and sacrifice. For the German fighter pilots, the campaign was catastrophic. Thousands of young men, many still teenagers, climbed into cockpits knowing survival was unlikely. They fought with courage and skill against overwhelming odds until death claimed them. The aces, the veterans, the squadron leaders, nearly all perished in combat or were captured. Few survived the war. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's leading ace with 352 victories, survived only because he fought primarily on the Eastern Front. After the war, he acknowledged what had transpired in the West. The Americans destroyed the Jagdwaffe over Germany in 1944. They possessed superior aircraft, greater numbers of aircraft, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought bravely, but we were overwhelmed. General Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. In January 1944, when Doolittle ordered the sign in Kapitän's office changed, many deemed it madness. By June, it was recognized as genius. The primary mission of fighters was indeed to eliminate enemy fighters. All else flowed from that principle. The Berlin raids, the destruction of German infrastructure, the protection of ground forces during the invasion, all became feasible because American fighters had systematically annihilated the Luftwaffe in 4 months of intensive combat. What had initially appeared reckless proved to be the sole path to victory. 70 years later, when military historians analyzed the air campaign over Europe, they consistently identified Doolittle's January directive as the pivotal turning point. A single decision, a singular shift in tactics, a general's willingness to challenge established doctrine completely transformed the air war. The bombers returned safely, not because fighters stayed near them, but because fighters eliminated German fighters before they could attack. The counterintuitive truth that offensive action provides superior protection compared to a defensive posture became doctrine. Air forces worldwide absorbed this lesson. Control of the air is achieved through the aggressive destruction of enemy aircraft, not through the reactive defense of friendly assets. Lieutenant General James Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946, having commanded the 8th, 15th, and 12th Air Forces during the war. He received numerous decorations, including the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and an honorary knighthood from Great Britain. Yet, of all his accomplishments, he considered the fighter directive his most significant decision. In a 1970s interview, Doolittle reflected on that January day. Changing the fighter tactics was the most difficult decision I made. Bomber commanders opposed it. Bomber crews feared it. Some fighter pilots considered it suicide. But I knew from my own experience as a fighter pilot that offensive action wins air battles. You cannot win by defending. You win by attacking. The losses were terrible, but they would have been worse under defensive tactics. We won because we embraced risk and attacked aggressively. The sign that Doolittle ordered removed from Kapitäners Wall in January 1944 now resides in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Adjacent to it hangs the replacement sign. Together, they narrate the story of a tactical revolution that secured air supremacy in Europe. For the bomber crews who survived the war, many credited Doolittle's decision with their survival. They had initially opposed the change, believing fighters leaving them to hunt Germans elsewhere constituted abandonment. Experience taught them otherwise. The most effective method of protecting bombers was to destroy enemy fighters before they could launch an attack. For the Luftwaffe, Doolittle's directive marked the beginning of the end. In October 1943, they had been winning the aerial war of attrition. 6 months later, they were decimated as an effective force. The confluence of American numerical superiority, technological advantage, superior training, and aggressive tactics proved overwhelming. The campaign from January to June 1944 exemplifies military principles that remain valid today. Offensive action prevails over defensive action when both sides possess roughly equivalent capabilities. Superior training yields superior results, even when outnumbered. Technological advantage, coupled with tactical innovation, creates decisive outcomes. Leadership willing to challenge doctrine and accept risk achieves strategic results. But most importantly, achieving air superiority necessitates the destruction of enemy fighters, not the protection of friendly aircraft. This counterintuitive truth, understood by Doolittle and proven in combat over Germany in 1944, remains the bedrock of air combat doctrine worldwide. The narrative of how one general's order to change a sign on a wall led to the destruction of the Luftwaffe within weeks is, ultimately, a story about comprehending the fundamental nature of aerial combat. Doolittle understood that fighters are offensive weapons whose primary purpose is the annihilation of enemy fighters. Employing them defensively squanders their potential and cedes initiative to the adversary. The bomber crews who initially feared his tactics came to grasp their wisdom. The German pilots who opposed those tactics learned of their effectiveness far too late. And military aviation learned lessons that would shape aerial warfare for generations. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under clear skies devoid of German aircraft, the success of Doolittle's strategy was absolute. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, which had annihilated air forces from Poland to France, which had reduced London to rubble, was nowhere to be seen.
American and British fighters had hunted them to extinction. A single tactical decision, a solitary shift in doctrine, a lone departure from conventional wisdom achieved what years of bombing could not. The Luftwaffe was destroyed not by attacking factories, but by attacking fighters. Not by defending bombers, but by hunting aggressively. Not by playing defense, but by seizing the offense. The sign was taken down on January 6, 1944. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was finished. The connection between these two events is direct, quantifiable, and undeniable. One general's seemingly reckless strategy had decimated the enemy air force in weeks, secured air supremacy over Europe, and ensured the triumph of the invasion that would liberate the continent. History would ultimately judge Jimmy Doolittle's decision to alter fighter tactics as one of the most consequential command decisions of World War II. Not because it was complex or technically sophisticated, but because it was fundamentally correct. The foremost duty of fighters is to destroy enemy fighters.